Everybody, this is Stephanie Johnson. She's going to talk to us a little bit about intentional camera movement, which, as I spoke to her a little while ago, she's made an art form out of something the rest of us try to stay away from. So we'll find out what's going on. So Stephanie, if you would, please take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Hylos. I'll go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to the Cobb Photographic Society today about intentional camera movement. It has been my passion, the thing that I've been primarily focused on for a number of years. I started doing ICM in 2017, and by 2018, I was fully invested in doing ICM as a form of creative expression. And gave up doing traditional landscape photography. I started out as a landscape photographer back in the 1990s, and I've always had a passion for photography, but over the years, I wasn't necessarily always able to really dedicate a lot of time to pursuing creative things. I was in a non-supportive marriage for many, many years. And in 2015, I went through a divorce after 24 years of marriage. And I was turning 50 that year. And I decided I'm going to start doing some things that I want to do, that I'm passionate about. So I started traveling. And I think it was Melissa and I were talking about Ireland. I started traveling to Ireland. That was a gift I gave to myself for my 50th birthday and just coming out of this divorce. And I fell in love with the landscapes there. And I'll talk a little bit about all of these things. I'm going to skip over this outline slide because I do want to talk a little bit more about my journey towards this more creative approach. And I started traveling to Ireland after that first trip in 2015. I was going to Ireland about every 2 to 3 months just to go and shoot the traditional landscapes there. They're very magnificent and very, scenic and grand landscapes. But I would come back to Iowa, which is where I live, and I would have a hard time really getting out with my camera. I found that I wasn't really connecting with my local landscape in quite the same way. So I, didn't go out with my camera. And after doing that for 2 or 3 years, I started to see ICM in 2017, and I also read a book by David Duchemin, a Canadian photographer, and the book was called A Beautiful Anarchy. And in that book, he talks about this idea that you have to do the work. You can't wait for inspiration to hit. You get out and do the work, and it's in the doing of the work that inspiration comes. And so taking the idea of ICM, having started to see it in 2017 and reading that book and learning, from David Duchemin or being encouraged by his writing to get out and do the work, I thought, well, maybe I can take this concept out into the Iowa landscape and reimagine it, redefine how I see, make a new connection to my local landscape. I grew up in Texas. I lived all over. I was in the military for 20 years. And so, Iowa's not necessarily where I have always lived and grown up, not where I grew up. And because of, circumstances, I didn't get out into the landscape and connect with it in quite the same way as I might in a place that I, found to be more scenic. But by taking this idea of getting out into the landscape and doing the work and seeing it differently by moving my camera around to create some interesting and different and unique kinds of images, I really fell in love with the landscapes of Iowa. And I have shot most of my work, I would say, probably now it's about 80% because I have started traveling again in the last 2 or 3 years, and I am leading workshops in various locations across the United States and in the UK. But I would say the bulk of my work over the years, the bulk of my creative work with ICM has been shot within a 30 to 50 mile radius of where I live. So I have really learned to connect to the local landscape, the local environment through this concept of seeing it differently by moving the camera and creating images that reflect the essence of that landscape more so than the literal interpretation of it. And so that's the journey for me, how I came to doing ICM. And I do want to say that if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat and I can keep an eye on that and answer those as we go along. But I started out doing ICM as single exposures, then I've moved on to doing multiple exposures, and certainly I'm doing mobile ICM. So I'm going to talk about all three of those presentation, but just as a brief introduction to ICM, for me, it's more than just a technique. It's a creative process. It's a form of artistic expression. It's how I express myself. I don't see the world in literal ways necessarily, and ICM has helped me to become more abstract in my vision. And it certainly is a technique, but it's more than just a technique in my view. And it asks us really to let go of a lot of the things we've previously learned about photography, like rules and perfectionism, sharpness, or this idea that there's a right and a wrong way to do it, because there really are no rules with ICM. There's no one right way to do it. There's no wrong way to do it. And certainly the images aren't necessarily going to be perfect or sharp by, the technical terms and rules and regulations that we often get bogged down with in photography, and especially doing traditional photography. But I do feel like if you give a dedicated amount of time to playing with ICM and experimenting and exploring with it, you can learn to refine your processes and to be able to see the potential of any given scene that you might be in. And it's going to enable you to respond to various elements in new and different ways. And certainly that has been the case for me as a creative photographer. So at the basic level, ICM is a very intentional process of moving the camera during the exposure of an image. But I have over time expanded that definition to include moving the camera in between exposures. If you're going to be doing like a series of multiple exposures, moving the camera in between those exposures can also be a form of intentional camera movement. It's typically using slower shutter speeds of about 1/10 of a second or slower. Certainly you can do ICM at faster shutter speeds, but the faster the shutter speed, the more difficult it's going to maybe be to control the results or to achieve the results you might be wanting. The first 3 years I was doing ICM, I did actually shoot at 1/13 of a second. That was my go-to shutter speed. Now I'm shooting at about a half a second. But I do play around and experiment with a lot of different shutter speeds. So I'm not set on the idea that I have to shoot at a half a second. I do experiment and I try new things. I'm always looking for ways to push the boundaries of my processes. And so learning what works best for you comes through this process of experimenting and playing and exploring. And it is more than just accidental camera shake. A lot of times, we can create images that are very pleasing by accidentally moving the camera or bumping the tripod and then seeing, what the image looks like on the back of the camera. But for me, ICM is really about this very intentional process and this very deliberate process of creation and creating with the camera. Some things to keep in mind about ICM. I from my perspective, I feel like controlling the shutter speed is the most important thing. It's more important than controlling aperture. I personally don't care what my aperture is. I want to control my shutter speed. So if I shoot in manual and I'm making my own adjustments to aperture and shutter speed as I'm working a particular scene. But if you're not comfortable shooting in manual, you could shoot in shutter priority and set the shutter speed to to the speed that you want to work with, and then not worry about what the aperture is going to be. If you're shooting in aperture priority, the camera is going to change the shutter speed, and you may not necessarily know what that shutter speed is going to be, or it might be too fast to get a really good shot. So I really feel like controlling the shutter speed is more important than aperture. And you don't have the same depth of field considerations or concerns necessarily that you would have if you're shooting, traditional landscapes or portraiture or any of those types of photography. It's really important to experiment with different focal lengths and different sizes and speeds of movement, because all of those different combinations of things are going to result in different kinds of effects in the images. So the only way to really get to grips with how things are manifesting in your images is just to play and experiment and try different things. 24 millimeters, you may, as a focal length, you may need to move the camera a lot more than you would to achieve the same kind of result than you would if you were shooting at 200 millimeters. So understanding those kinds of things is really important, and the best way to get to really get to know how all of that comes into play is by doing a lot of work. So this next slide is some of the different types of movements. I won't go over this in detail because I will talk about a lot of these different types of movements as we go through the slides. And then I also do have a really short video coming up on the next slide to show you how I work with the camera when I'm out in several different kinds of field environments, in landscape and in urban environments. But these are some really easy ways that you can get started with working with ICM if it's something that you've never done before. And so, but the thing I like to really encourage people is to just have fun and experiment. There's no right or wrong way to do it. And if you can think of a way to move the camera, try it and see what happens. Because if you don't at least try it, you'll never know. And so it's really, really important to just play and have fun. I think ICM has helped me loosen up. I have a very kind of rigid personality just in general. I'm very OCD. I have a very high attention to detail. I was in the Marines for 20 years, so that might, have play a role in why I have that kind of a personality. But ICM has really helped me not take myself quite so seriously and to loosen up and let go and just allow myself to be free and, flow in the moment. So you'll see that in this next slide, which is a video. It's a 2-minute video. There's no talking in the video, it's just music, but it will hopefully give you an idea of how I work with the camera, how I'm moving, and just a few different, things about, my movements and how I hold the camera out in front of me. I don't use the viewfinder. I do use the LCD screen. And so hopefully it'll be helpful just to give you an idea of how I'm working with the camera, and then we'll have a look at some images. So let me get the video up here and we'll go ahead and watch that now. So there was a question in the chat that asks about the shutter, pressing the shutter. I do press the shutter at the same time I start my movement. That's just my technique. That's how I've always done it. But certainly you can start moving the camera first and then press the shutter if you'd like. You know, there are occasions where I might start the movement first, like if I want to be sure I get a very straight horizon line, I might start moving my camera, watching through the LCD screen, the horizon, to be sure I'm staying on that straight trajectory, and then press the shutter. But for the most part, I am pressing the shutter and starting my movement at the same time. So this first set of images, or first set of slides that I want to show you, are single exposure ICMs. And I really feel like it's important to get to grips with ICM through single exposures first. There are a lot of people coming to ICM these days who want to just jump right in and start doing multiple exposure ICMs, and that's fine. But I feel like if you have a firm foundation of what the different effects are going to be from, you know, using different sizes and speeds of movements and different focal lengths, both with single exposures before you start doing multiple exposure ICMs, it will help, you know, it would just enhance your process and enhance your ability to create more pleasing images as multiple exposures. That's just my personal opinion. And for the first 5 years I was doing ICM, I only did single exposures. I've had the capability all of this time. I use a Canon 5D Mark. Well, I was using first using a 5D Mark III, and now I use a Mark IV, and I do have always had that capability to do multiple exposure ICMs in the camera, but I never tried it actually until early 2022. So the first 5 years I was only doing single exposures. And so trees are a great subject to get started with. These are some tree images where I've used a variety of different kinds of movements to create different kinds of effects. You can get the very, you know, straight vertical linear lines by doing a straight vertical motion, just something like this. You saw in the video, I was doing this wavy sort of S-curve motion, and that is the image actually from that particular outing in the video. This image here on the top right is just a circular shaking motion, so something similar to this movement. And then the diagonal movement, moving, you know, from top right to bottom left, or top left to bottom right, any direction you want to go, but moving the camera vertically or diagonally. And you can go from bottom to top also. You don't have to go top to bottom. I like to generally go top to bottom, whether I'm doing straight vertical movement or diagonal movement. And that's just a personal preference thing that I have, but you can decide for yourself what works best for you. You can zoom the lens. This image on the bottom in the center is zooming the lens. And then there's a horizontal wavy motion. So, you know, we have this intuition that we should just follow the lines of whatever the subject is that we are photographing, but you don't have to follow the lines. You can do something horizontal with trees, or do a wavy kind of motion with trees. You're going to get completely different kinds of effects by doing, you know, going against the actual lines of the particular subject you might be working with. You know, the first camera that I started using when I was starting out doing ICM was just a compact point and shoot camera, a Canon G7X. And this image here on the left is one of my favorite images still to this date, and it was using that Canon G7X, that point and shoot camera. When I first started going out in the landscape here in Iowa to do ICM, it kind of felt at that particular time that I wasn't, you know, I wasn't using it as a serious form of creative expression. It was just playing, and I still play. I'm not to say that I don't still play, but because I was still in that mindset that I'm a landscape photographer, I felt like I needed to save my DSLR for my serious work of landscape photography, and it going out with that small little compact point and shoot camera kind of gave me a little bit more permission to play and just experiment. And it was easy to carry and easy to take out with me on walks with my dog. But then eventually, when I started to see the potential for taking my artistry in a new direction, I did start using my DSLR, and that's all I use now, except for when I do use my mobile device. But I didn't do mobile ICM even for many, many years. I felt like mobile photography wasn't really photography. And so I was hesitant or reluctant to do mobile ICMs or mobile photography. And in 2017 and 2018, nobody was doing ICMs with a mobile device anyway. Well, not very many people, if there were. I don't know of any that were. That hasn't really happened or kind of exploded until the last couple of years, I don't think. But again, these two images are examples. We've seen this image already. I talked about the S-curve, wavy S-curve motion. The image on the left is also an S-curve motion, but it's two different sizes and speeds of movements, creating two different kinds of effects. So this is an example of that. The image on the left is a looser, wider S-curve motion, whereas the image on the right is a very tight, fast S-curve motion. So size and speed of movement creating a different kind of effect. And again, this image is just a circular shaking motion, something similar to this, and it creates a more impressionistic look and feel. You can see the lines of where the light's reflecting off of leaves, and that can, if you look at ICM images, that can oftentimes tell you what the movement was by seeing what are the lines doing. And in this particular scene, the thing that caught my attention was the way the light was falling on the grasses on the floor of this woodland area. So oftentimes, for me, when I'm out with my camera, it is whatever catches my attention. I don't go out with any kind of preconceived idea that I'm going to do this with my camera when I go out. I just go out, I just start moving, I just start playing, seeing what's happening, and then I can try to dial things in if I see something happening that I really like, or I can just be free and allow myself to create in the moment and not worry about the results. I'm not really a results-driven kind of person. I'm more about the process than I am about the results. And so I can go out and shoot 300, 500 exposures on any given outing and come back and never even actually look at my images for a week or 2 weeks or a month. Because for me, just getting out and being immersed in the creative process is enough, is fulfilling enough for me in a lot of cases. Sunrises and sunsets are also some great subjects. If you have, especially if you have a water feature, I love to go to the lake that's close to where I live and do my sunrise and sunset shoots. And so because I get that, that reflection of color in the water oftentimes, but, you can do sunset and sunrise shots of just a regular landscape scene, especially if you've got some really beautiful color in the sky. But oftentimes you're going to have a lot more darkness and more, more of the scene is going to be in shadow because the ground, the foreground is solid, whereas with water you get either that water effect, the color of the water, or the light reflecting on that water. and that's adding to the atmosphere. So, these are some different types of movements, just horizontal movement. Of course, our instinct with a horizon is that we're going to move horizontally with it because it is a horizon. But you don't have to do that. You could do vertical movement with a horizon and you're going to get a completely different effect. I like to do this thing where actually, I get my camera, I roll the camera. So I'm moving the camera and then twist it. So horizontal movement with a bit of a twist. And then, just a wavy motion. So the wavy motion is going to help create some ribbons of light, perhaps if you have the right lighting conditions. I always like to work with the light, with the sun before it's gone completely below the horizon. So there might just be a little sliver of that sun still above the horizon, and that helps to create some of this kind of effect. But also haze can help create that. This is another example, the image on the vertical image on the right. It's a diagonal wavy motion, but again, working with that last bit of light, and that's what creates that yellow line that's going through the center of the frame there. So you can create some, geometric shapes with the light, or just different kinds of effects. Again, this is just a wavy motion, so something like up, down, and over to create that wave of light that's just really beautiful with the way the light was in that particular scene. And you see my settings, and on all of these slides, I do like to show my settings, but I want to just stress that that doesn't necessarily mean these settings are going to be the same settings you'll want to work with. You have to decide in the moment for yourself, and whatever's presented in front of you, what are the best settings for you. So although I do provide my settings, it's not a formulaic approach. You can't necessarily take the fact that I did this at sunset and I shot at f/22 in 1/3 of a second and go out and use those settings yourself and get the same kind of result. It's very individual. It's very in the moment kind of thing. So you just have to figure out, by doing a lot of work, what works best for you in any particular given moment or scene. Again, just another kind of wavy horizontal movement to capture that beautiful light on the horizon line. So, again, I feel like being able to, or being open to seeing the possibilities of any given scene is really, really important. Like I mentioned, I don't pre-visualize. I don't go out and have an expectation of what's going to happen or what I'm going to create. I just go out and start moving. Sometimes you can't know what's going to happen until you start moving the camera. And I don't wait for perfect light. I don't wait for, the perfect conditions. I don't feel like you have to wait for the perfect gear. You don't have to have perfect gear. A lot of people ask about ND filters, and yes, I do use an ND filter now, but the first 3 years I was doing ICM, I did not use an ND filter. I just relied on the fact that I could go up to f/32 by using my long lens. This is my go-to lens, my 70 to 200 millimeter lens. And if I'm out in the middle of the afternoon with my 70 to 200 millimeter lens and I can't get a slow enough shutter speed at f/32 by pointing my camera off in this direction, I'm just going to look around and see where can I point my camera and what can I work with to achieve the shutter speed I want to work with. I never say you can't do, and there are a lot of people out there that will say that you have to have an ND filter to do ICM. I do not subscribe to that. I did it for 3 years. So I will never say or suggest to anyone that you have to have an ND filter. I feel like it's more important, rather than relying on the gear, to just find a way to work with whatever is presented in front of you, because there's always something in that particular scene that you can work with. There's always going to be something that you can use as a subject to work with in any given scene or situation. You just have to be open to starting to try and play and move the camera and see what happens. So just a few additional examples. This is just a wavy motion. This is river rapids, so a wavy kind of motion to capture the waves of light, mimicking that motion of the river rapids. These are tall grasses. These are both using that horizontal movement with a twist. So just horizontally moving the camera and then twisting it to create that effect, which kind of feels like a rotation effect or a circular movement. And the tall grasses have the stalks are usually in shadow. In this particular field that I go to, the stalks are usually in shadows. These are 16 to 18 feet tall grasses, and then because of that twisting motion, the tops of the grasses are what are creating or helping to add to that rotational effect that you see in these images. This is an example of same subject, two different sizes and speeds of movement. So the image on the left is a loose shaking motion. The image on the right is a very fast, tight shaking motion. Looser shaking motion is going to give you more recognizability of the subject. Very tight shaking motion is going to give you less of the literal lines of the subject, but an even more impressionistic look and feel. This is just breaks of light coming through clouds. There was a very fast moving storm, and coming in when I was out for sunset one evening, and I just saw that light coming in through these breaks in the clouds, and I just thought, oh, that's really beautiful. What can I do with it? So I just started flipping the camera up and over, and seeing what I could do. And it felt like I was bending the light. When I saw this unfolding on the back of the camera, it felt like I was bending the light. And that was really exciting. This is a macro shot with a macro lens, and it's holding the camera still for a portion of the 1 second shutter speed. So hold still and then a tiny little wave off. Holding still will help imprint the literal lines of the flower or whatever the subject may be. And then the wave off just gives it this ethereal look and feel, like the flowers floating in air. This is another example of same subject, two different types of movements and speeds of movements to create different effects. So this is the same building. The image on the left is that loose shaking motion, which gives you that the literal lines of the subject. You can see that it is a building. The image on the right is the same building, but just very fast sweeping motion like this. That turns that building into just layers of light and layers of color and layers of lines. So different sizes and speeds of movement to create completely different effects on the same subject. And then urban environments. I do get up to Chicago quite a bit. So I do love to work with ICM in urban environments as well. When I'm home in Iowa, I generally am shooting landscapes. I just like to go out, spend my time being re-energized by the landscape. But when I do travel, I do love to do urban ICMs as well. And so these are some examples of some urban single exposure ICMs. I want to talk now a little bit about multiple exposure. And when I say ICM, and when I say multiple exposure ICM, what I mean is I am moving the camera for all of the exposures of the multiple exposure sequence. So if I've got my camera set to 2 exposures, each exposure is going to be ICM. If I've got my camera set to 4 exposures, all 4 of those exposures are going to be ICM. I am starting to play this year with doing some new things where I'm maybe not moving the camera and doing ICM for 1 or 2 exposures and not doing ICM for some exposures. But these next examples are going to be all multiple exposure ICMs where I have moved the camera during the exposure for all exposures of the sequence. And I like to work with bright and dark blend mode, and I'll talk a little bit more about those. But this is essentially 2 exposures in bright blend mode where I've done a loose shaking motion for one exposure and a vertical motion for the second exposure to create this kind of fantasy feel. When I saw this happening on the back of the camera, I just thought, oh my goodness, I'm creating a fantasy world. It looks and feels like I'm creating something out of Avatar. And yes, you can do this in Photoshop. You could take 2 images and blend them together in Photoshop, but the excitement that I have always felt in being able to see this and do this and create this and craft this in the moment, in the field, has always been the driving force really for me. This is a comparison slide of the different blend modes because bright and dark blend mode do different things compared to average blend mode. So in average blend mode, you will be seeing all of the effects of each of the exposures. You can see how that comes through in this image on the right. Where you can see all of the vertical lines and all of the horizontal lines. It comes down to, the camera is blending them together and averaging the exposures, and then all of the elements come through in the final blended image. But in bright and dark blend mode, that's not the case. In bright blend mode, bright gets the priority. Whatever is brightest across the 2 exposures, or however many exposures you're using, that's what gets the priority, and that's what comes through in the final blended image. You can see in the center here, this tree is in shadow on the left side, so it's very, very dark compared to whatever's in the same location of the first exposure. So the right side of the tree is lit up by the highlights or by the sun, and so it's highlit on that side, and you do see that come through, but you don't see the shadow side of that tree. And all of these lines, vertical lines, which are much brighter in that particular area, that's what comes through. That's what happens in bright and dark blend mode. Whatever blend mode you're in, that's what gets the priority. So here for dark blend mode, dark gets the priority. So whatever's darkest across the exposures, that's what comes through in the final blended image. And we saw in the video where I showed that even a blown out sky, you can shoot a completely blown out sky in dark blend mode, knowing that framing the next shot so that you don't get any sky, that dark area is going to fill in that blown out area from the first exposure. Now, if I had composed this second exposure and I still had that much sky in my second exposure, it's still going to be bright. Dark blend mode doesn't mean that there aren't going to be any bright areas in your final blended image, because if this is all bright and this is all bright, there's nothing dark to take priority. So, this is where I say working with multiple exposure ICMs in the field can really help you. You can learn to craft your images by composing them in very artistic ways to bring out the artistry of the images that are being blended by the camera. So these images that I've just shown you and the ones I'm going to show on these next couple of slides are what I like to call multiple exposure ICM sequences. They're my type 1 multiple exposure ICM because they are sequences. I'm very intentionally and deliberately sequencing these. These images are being taken in sequence. So just like, I showed you on this slide here, these were taken in sequence. First exposure, second exposure, third final blended image. And so I'm doing all of these in sequence in the camera. And so if you don't have multiple exposure capability in your camera, like Sony's don't have that option, you could take images in sequence in the same way and then blend them in Photoshop. Average blend mode, which is in the camera, would be similar to something like overlay. Bright blend mode would be lighten in Photoshop, and dark blend mode would be darken in Photoshop. This image here is an example of how I flip the camera upside down. So the first exposure is just a horizontal movement, and this is a sunset over a landscape area. So there's no water in this particular scene, but because I flip the camera upside down and do a wavy motion for the second exposure, that helps bring the sky into the top and the bottom of the frame by flipping it upside down. And it gives it, you know, if this was a single exposure, this darkness is what you would see in the bottom of the frame. You wouldn't see any of this light, but by flipping the camera upside down and being in bright blend mode, you can create that kind of effect. This is a bright blend mode, just a shaking motion for one exposure and a wavy vertical motion for the second exposure. And this is just highlights on the tops of grasses at sunset. And I just loved the way that contrast between those highlights and the shadows in the wooded area behind were interplaying with each other. But you can also be very artistic. The image here on the right is just a wall hanging in a place that I was staying, and using dark blend mode and playing with this wall hanging and just trying different corners of it and doing 2 or 3 exposures of a multiple exposure sequence and seeing how they were blending together enabled me to completely transform that. The image on the left here is a shop window or a shop entrance in Dublin, actually. Melissa's going to Ireland in the spring, and this is in the Temple Bar area. This is a very colorful shop entrance that I was playing around with the colorful signs and the lights that were hanging over the door, using dark blend mode to create a very unique and different kind of artistic image. This is bright blend mode, working with just some trees and some grasses to create this effect here. And then I want to show you how you can get different effects using the same subject, but using different blending modes, because a lot of times people will ask me, how do you decide whether to use bright blend mode or dark blend mode? And I don't decide. I just try them both and see what's going to happen. You don't have to make a choice. You don't have to walk up on a scene and say, oh, that should be dark blend mode, or no, that should be bright blend mode. Try them both and see what happens, because you'll get different effects. You'll get completely different kinds of effects. These are just icicles hanging on the side of a limestone bluff, and not a really great and attractive just scene just in general, but playing with the way the light was reflecting off of those icicles was what caught my attention. And so playing with that by doing bright blend mode on the left and dark blend mode on the right, I was able to create 2 different effects. These are the Manhattan skyline, and this is an example again of flipping the camera upside down. And what happens when you are using bright blend mode, you're bringing the sky into the top and the bottom, because obviously the sky is much brighter than the river below. And in the image on the right, it's the river, because in dark blend mode, the river is darker. So in this particular image, the river, the darkness of the river is what gets brought into the top and the bottom of the frame to create a really different kind of effect. And again, this is the same kind of situation working with some standing stones in Scotland, where it just gives these standing stones an even kind of more ethereal and mystical look and feel by playing with bright and dark blend mode to create different effects, bringing the sky into top and bottom, which makes it feel like the stones are just floating in air, or bringing the foreground into the top and the bottom and giving that a completely different kind of mood and look and feel. So the other type that I like to talk about with multiple exposures is what I call high frame rate or rapid fire ME ICMs. And what this means to me is that I'm usually moving the camera around the scene, and I'm using more exposures and probably a little bit faster shutter speed than I normally would. So probably around 1/10 of a second, 1/8 of a second. And what I'm doing, if I have my exposure set to 9 exposures, I'd be doing something like this. Click, 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 click. I'd be moving the camera, pressing the shutter, and moving it around the scene. And that creates these very, you know, well, kind of impressionistic looks and feels, but they also just reveal the energy and the vibrancy, especially with the color. This is just downtown Iowa City with a street festival that was going on. And again, in average blend mode, you're going to see all of the elements from all of those 9 exposures or however many exposures you might be using, because nothing is getting the priority. These 2 images are both zooming while moving the camera. So doing something like click, 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 and maybe zooming while I'm doing 2 or 3 of those exposures, that helps create some of that rotation or that spinning effect. And again, adds to the energy and the vibrancy. And again, using average blend mode. But if you were to do this high frame rate using bright blend mode, this would be what you would get, something similar to this, where the brights are getting the priority. It has a much different look and feel to it compared to what you get with average blend mode. So play around with the different blending modes, even on these high frame rate images as well. This is using dark blend mode, where dark is getting the priority to create an interesting effect, and using about 4 to 5 exposures, moving the camera around the scene for that particular image. So now I'd like to talk about mobile ICMs, because as I mentioned, over the last, I would say probably 2 to 3 years, it seems that more and more people, probably more than, maybe more towards 3 years, because I only just embraced doing mobile ICMs in the last couple of years. But there were people I noticed, in the Facebook group that I am the admin for the magazine. There have always been people in the last 3 years at least, I know, that have been doing mobile ICMs. And the apps for Androids and the apps for iPhones they're not interchangeable. So that there are more limited apps, I would say, for Androids to do creative kinds of photography than there are with the iPhone, and especially if you're wanting to do ICM. And I am an Android user. I've always been an Android user. And the first app that I started to play around with for the Android device was this camera FV5. And it enables you to extend the shutter speed when you go into this synthetic exposure setting, and then you can choose between film type or light trail type. And essentially the difference between those two is that film type is more like average blend mode, and light trail type is more like bright blend mode. But you're not really shooting multiple exposures. You're only pressing the shutter one time, but it creates this effect that feels like a multiple exposure in a way, and it's a little bit more of a digitized look and feel, because mobile device cameras don't work the same way that DSLR and mirrorless cameras work. The lens is not staying open for a half a second or 1 second on your mobile devices the way it does when you're working with a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. The camera is actually rapidly firing off multiple exposures for the length of time you have your shutter speed set for. So it gives a lot more of a digital kind of look and feel to the images. And also in these 2 particular images, both in Times Square in New York City, they have that look and feel like the high frame rate to a certain extent that I get with my DSLR. A lot of times in the post-processing of my mobile multiple ICMs in this way, I will bring the clarity way down to soften that digital feel quite a bit. But I've recently this year actually learned about this new, I don't know if it's new, I don't know how long it's been around. I've only just learned about it earlier this year, Expert Raw. And I think it's only available for Galaxy models. I don't think it's available for a Google Pixel or other non-Samsung devices. But it does give you that option to do multiple exposures using additive, average, bright, and dark blend mode, similar to what you could do with your DSLR. And you can play around with and you can do this in your DSLR as well. I didn't talk about this, but playing around with color temperature. You can set the color temperature to the high end or the low end and do multiple exposures. You can change the color temperature even when you're working with your DSLR. You can change the color temperature in the middle of a sequence to try to create different kinds of effects. So this is using that same sort of high frame rate technique, but doing it with a mobile device, with the Android device, by moving the camera and firing my shutter, around the subject and creating these effects. So that's Expert Raw. I did buy an iPhone about a year ago because I wanted to have the ability to do more creative work with a mobile device, and knowing that I was somewhat limited with an Android, and knowing just from seeing all the work that people post in the Facebook group, and some have even been featured in the magazine by using slow shutter cam app, for instance. I knew that the iPhone apps are a little bit more creative and a little bit more conducive to playing and working with ICM. So I did buy an iPhone. And these are two apps that a lot of people use. There's certainly many more apps out there for iPhones. These are not available on Android, and those two apps I talked about for Android are not available for iPhone. But these are the two main ones that I would say that I see most people using and that I have played around with myself. And so with the slow shutter cam app, you can do single exposures and multiple exposures. And again, you have these three different types of capture mode. Motion blur would be similar to average, light trail would be similar to bright blend mode, and low light would be similar to dark blend mode. Not exactly, it's not an exact, one-for-one exchange, because the mobile devices work differently than the DSLRs and the mirrorless cameras. But I would say in comparison, that would be how I would compare them. And again, you do get these you still are going to get very digital kinds of lines and looks and feels. And these two, I have not brought down the clarity. But in this particular image here, I did bring the clarity way down, -100, and that has helped soften. You can still see a little bit of that digital effect, but I can guarantee you at the default setting of 0 on the clarity, that would be much more pronounced than it is in either of these two images. And this, again, these two images again are using that slow shutter cam app. So you can do ICM and multiple exposures with the slow shutter cam app. And then Average Cam Pro also enables you to use up to 128 exposures if you'd like. I generally stick to around 8, and it is going to be again similar to that high frame rate technique that I use in the DSLR. And again, I've brought down the clarity way down, -100 on both of these, to soften that digital look and feel. I do feel like bringing down the clarity softens those lines quite a bit, and it gives it more of a painterly look. Melissa just said, looks like pastels on rough paper. And I feel like when you bring the clarity down, it does help give the images a little bit more of a painterly feel to them. So these are also average Cam Pro, 8 exposures for all of these. And you're basically, I'm moving the camera. It counts down. When you press the shutter, it counts down. So if you're at 8, if you're set to 8 exposures, I would press the shutter and then it would start 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And I can move the camera around the scene to try to build the image the way that I want to. So it's a lot of fun to play and experiment with these mobile device apps to do ICM as well. So I want to just show a few before and after examples. I don't know how much time you all have. Hylos had mentioned a 1-hour presentation, and we are at 1 hour. So I'll try to go through these fairly quickly so that I don't keep you too much longer. But I do want to show you some before and after examples to see what the scene looked like before I did ICM and then what it looked like after I did ICM. And then some of the things that I look for, because in this particular scene, this is typical Iowa in the wintertime, although most of the time we have a lot more ice and snow. But this was, I think, moving on towards spring where things were starting to thaw out a little bit. And there are, pockets of ice on the river and on this sandbank itself. And that is helping to add some texture and visual interest. So things that you wouldn't even maybe pay attention to, like that ice on the river way down, down the river, it's adding some visual interest. It's adding some texture to that image. It's also creating some white on the browns and the tans. And I love that combination of those blues and the tans. But the color of the sky is reflecting really beautifully in the water as well. And so that was what caught my attention. This is the before scene of this image that we saw earlier. And this is those are those grasses. And it was the way the light was hitting those grasses that just really drew me in and made me want to stop and work with this particular scene. This is columns in a walkway in front of a museum of art, the Native American Museum of Art in Santa Fe. And you can see how the columns on the left side are all red. They're not colorful. They're not painted all these different colors. But by using that upside down technique and multiple exposure, I was able to bring those colorful columns into both sides of the frame. And then also because of just the nature of this being a walkway under a pergola or whatever you want to call this, it creates this effect of depth by being drawn into something that's further down the walkway there. These are those tall grasses that I talked about earlier, and one of the images that we saw. So this is that particular scene, and I go to this field of grasses, which is used as a biofuel project for the University of Iowa. They make biofuel. Cut these once they're all dried, once the grasses are dried up, they cut them down and they make pellets out of them, and then they're used as a coal replacement. And so this is a very fast growing grass. It grows every year and they cut it down and then it just comes back. So it's very economical fuel replacement. But I go to this same field of grasses over and over and over again all throughout the year, even in the wintertime. And there's this big pile of dirt that's usually there in some part of the field. And at this particular time, I thought, well, what if I used that as and incorporated that into an image using ICM? Because I wouldn't generally just take a big, a picture of a big pile of dirt, but by playing and doing that horizontal with a twist movement like this, I was able to create an effect that felt like a mountain rising up out of the snow. And then all of these footprints and four-wheeler and snowmobile tracks in the snow were helping to create some textural elements as well. So a lot of times, you know, as landscape photographers, we're wanting pristine snow and pristine sand when we're in a scene like this, or a beach scene or a seaside scene or something like that. But those things can actually help add visual interest when you're working with ICM. So this is another image similar to the one we saw earlier. This is that same scene I was talking about, with the sunset being over a landscape instead of a sea, or instead of a water feature. And so if I had not turned the camera upside down, all you would see in the bottom half of the frame would be the darkness of that land in the foreground. But by flipping the camera upside down, I can bring that beautiful light into the top and the bottom of the frame. These are those icicles where we saw earlier the dark bright and dark blend mode versions. That's what those icicles look like. Just kind of scraggly side of a limestone bluff, but I loved the way the light was hitting them, and that's what caught my attention and made me stop. This is a grand landscape scene, but I've honed in on just a part of it. This was on Three Cliffs Bay in Wales. This is in Wales, and it's a beautiful, magnificent landscape. But I find with my ICMs, if I'm not doing a sunset or a sunrise kind of feature or image, I oftentimes will just narrow it in on a particular part of the scene. And that's why I say also, you know, this was the middle of the afternoon. I could have easily said, oh, it's too bright, I can't shoot here. But because if I was looking out to the sea, which is, you know, off in this direction, it would have been too bright. But by turning around and looking at what was behind me, I'm able to create beautiful single exposure and very intriguing and different kind of multiple exposure. And then this is a scene here local to me. Again, very middle of the day, bright sun, but by not bringing in any of the sky and only focusing on this part of the frame, I was able to shoot in the middle of the day with nothing more than my 3-stop ND filter and shooting at f/32. And I think I was even able to shoot at, I can't remember if I was at a half a second or not, but yeah, the ice here, this water, of course, is very bright, and a lot of these highlights probably are blown out, but the effect that I was able to get here, I don't care if those highlights are blown out, because I like the effect. It kind of feels like etching to me. And so it's more about the effect and the result than it is about whether or not the highlights are blown out. So it's okay to blow out your highlights if that's what you want to do. This is another scene where I have just narrowed it in on a small portion of the scene based on the way the light was hitting these leaves on these trees and these ferns on the ground, but also the contrast of that with those dark shadows in the background. I really am always drawn to the contrast between highlights and shadows, and so I'm always stopping to work with something like that if I see it. This is creating an interesting effect with just a small cascade in a small little river. Again, you know, I could have worked with the big scene, overall scene, but I liked the effect I was able to get by just focusing in on this and playing with that water that's falling down, but then also playing with that water foam at the bottom of the fall to create an interesting effect. And this is a local river to me where there's a limestone bluff on the side of the river, and I again am working with the highlights and in contrast with those shadows. I love that. So again, these highlights, some of them were blown out, but I'm working in the middle of the afternoon, 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I, you know, was able to create something that I really liked. Of course, I'm going to have to underexpose quite a bit, uh, so that I can try to minimize the blowing out of those highlights, which means that my shadows are going to be really, really dark. But even in the case of this, I underexposed because of those highlights, but bringing those, and in the original raw file, this was very, very dark. The top part of the frame and the bottom part of the frame were both very, very dark, but I can bring the shadows up in post-processing, and it doesn't get too noisy. There are a lot of ICM photographers out there who will say they never underexpose. They always try to expose correctly or overexpose. But I underexpose more often than not because I'm not afraid to bring up those shadows. And even in the case of this, you don't see a lot of noise, even though this was almost completely black because I had underexposed. I was able to bring up those shadows and reveal a little hint of some details. I don't need a lot of detail because this to me is the focal point, but I like to see that that little bit of detail, and it's not too noisy, which is generally what would happen if you're bringing up the shadows quite a lot. This is a before and after example with the Android camera FV5. This is the Design Museum in London. I loved the way the light was filling this particular venue, and then the colors and the architecture, the geometry of it. So with ICM, I was able to transform that, reimagine it, and turn it into something even that much more dreamlike. This is the side of a cliff in Northumberland, and this is playing with the slow shutter cam app using doing multiple exposures. So softening those rocks and the side of that cliff, and then making it more just about the colors and the flowing lines, more so than the rocks and the cliff itself. So that's the thing about ICM really, is that you're revealing the essence of a scene. This is that scene. We saw this image with the Average Cam Pro earlier. And by moving the camera around the scene, I was able to create this effect that feels like there are mountains behind mountains. But you can see from the original scene, there's just the one mountain ridge. There's no mountains behind those mountains, but you can create an effect that gives the feeling of something completely different. And so that's the beauty of ICM really for me. And just a few things to keep in mind as we wrap things up is that, again, there are no rules with ICM, and it really is something that you can learn to embrace, just breaking free of the standard photographic conventions and just play and experiment, have fun. I don't use a tripod, but certainly you can use a tripod. But I feel like if you start out using a tripod doing ICM, eventually, if you continue to evolve and grow with your technique, you're going to want to get it off the tripod and just be free to move. It's like a paintbrush, using your camera as a paintbrush, but you're not painting on a canvas. You're painting, you know, with the camera in a much different kind of way, but creating images that represent a different kind of vision, artistic vision. And again, I've said this 100 times if I've said it once. It's all about having fun, exploring, playing, experimenting, trying new things. The magazine is a project that came out of my passion for ICM. It was started in 2020, and so it's 4 years old. The most recent issue was just released a couple of days ago, the September 2024 issue, and it celebrates ICM photographers and artists around the world. And I have a vision actually, because I'm starting to evolve and expand my own artistry even more with ICM and doing some new things and creating some, using creative post-processing more than I have in the past, and blending some analog. I've been doing some cyanotype work, and I'm starting to do some painting again, and I'm blending some of those. I'm digitizing, I'm scanning my cyanotypes and making them digital files, and then blending those with my ICMs and my multiple exposure ICM. So So I have this vision to expand the magazine project to include more of these creative types of photography, and also kind of redefining what ICM even stands for. We know ICM right now as intentional camera movement, but I'd like to redefine it to mean intentional creative moments, to embrace all creativity with the camera, not just a particular technique or style or process, but to embrace all of it. Because after doing ICM for well, since 2017, I came to a point at the beginning of this year where I felt like I wasn't able to create anything I hadn't done before, even with my multiple exposures. So I needed something to push me further, because I'm not content to just sit still and just do the same thing over and over and over again and create the same look and feel with my images over and over. I always want to be pushing the boundaries. I just have that kind of driven personality and mentality of always wanting to be pushing the boundaries of myself, my creativity, my artistry, what I'm capable of. And so taking some of my images, my multiple exposure and my ICM images, even into Photoshop, and layering and blending and rotating and flipping and using brushes and different kinds of blending modes. I've been playing with that. That's part of that whole intentional creative moment aspect of all of this, and pushing the boundaries. So more to come on that with the magazine. That's my website, Steph John Photo. If you want to see more of the new work that I've been doing, I've got some of that on my website. And then these are the ways you can connect with me. I'm always happy to connect, so feel free to, connect on Facebook or Instagram. I also have a YouTube channel where I like to put some inspirational videos of my work. I don't really have any tutorials on my YouTube channel because I do teach for organizations that expect people to pay for the things that I teach, and so I don't put a lot of that kind of content out for free on my YouTube channel. But I'm always happy to answer questions. If anybody emails me, I do try to respond, and I'm happy to share techniques and processes when I'm asked. So, don't hesitate to reach out anytime.
Well,
And
Stephanie,
that's it.
thank you so much. I learned a lot. It was not just moving the cameras, a lot of thought that goes behind it, moving the camera. That was great. Anybody got any questions, comments?
Well, I think it's inspiring that we have something new that we can do with a boring scene. I get bored
Exactly.
really easily.
Exactly.
Yeah, and you can go to the same locations over and over and over again. I go to the same locations all throughout the year. If I feel like being creative, I just go out with my camera, even to a location I've been hundreds of times, and I can always create something new and different because every day is different, the lighting's different, the conditions are different, the foliage is going to be different, the people are going to be different if you're in an urban environment. So it's absolutely possible to create in the same locations and scenes over and over and over again.
Well, Stephanie, we thank you. We would let you go. We're going to be doing some club business. I know it won't be a whole lot of interest to you, but we do certainly thank you for what you've done for us tonight. I learned a lot.
Great job, Stephanie. Thank you.